Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and with me is the great Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, we are always happy to have you on this show.
Well, the feeling is mutual. I'm very happy to be with you.
Now, it's funny, we're now halfway across all the way across the country. You're in LA, I'm in Orlando. We were just together yesterday, in the last few days, though, at the LA Religious Education Congress, which is kind of there in your backyard. It's in Anaheim. Right. Now, tell us, what is this Congress? You've been going to it for years, haven't you?
Yeah. Well, it's probably the biggest event in American Catholicism. The roots of it stretch back all the way to the 1950s, when I think they organized, a series of talks for the catechists and teachers in LA. And to make a long story short, it just grew and grew throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I think by the 80s, it had really become a sort of national phenomenon where people began coming from all over California, then all over the West, and then all over the country and indeed the world. And so by the time I first came, it would have been like the mid to late 1990s maybe. It was a phenomenon. It was the event, attracting upwards of 40,000 people. So nothing quite like it in the American church. And it's a gathering of all these people to listen to a variety of speakers. It's been a little bit controversial over the years because of some of the speakers they've had. My approach was always, if a organization like this gives me a platform, they don't censor my words, well, why not? Why wouldn't you go to address the audience? Not that I agreed with every speaker. I didn't, and I don't. But I think it's a great opportunity, So I went beginning in, I say, the late 90s, and then they invited me pretty much every year after that. And I couldn't always come, but I tried to come typically. So I did, 9 or 10 appearances maybe. I was the keynote speaker twice over these years. So it's been a great forum for me. I've talked about Balthazar and Newman and Aquinas and all my heroes, and always got a very warm response. The keynote is given in the arena, which is like a basketball arena. Seats, I think, about 20,000 people. So, it's a great opportunity for a speaker. You also see every aspect of the Catholic Church. There's a giant room where the vendors and various people have their displays. And you walk around that thing and you see, everything. So it's always been an experience. Now, of course, I'm an auxiliary bishop of the diocese where it's held. So I was there really in two capacities. One was in my Word on Fire capacity. I hung around the booth and signed books and all that. I was also there as one of the auxiliaries of the LA Archdiocese. So anyway, it was fun, as it always is.
We were there for maybe 3 or 4 days, and you came over to the Word on Fire booth several times to meet people, to greet fans of Word on Fire and sign books and stuff like that. I could only look on and smile because I know you told me, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, you could just stroll right through the expo hall and nobody would, bat an eyelash. But then the Catholicism series came out, all your videos on YouTube, and now you're kind of like a rock star. People just are swarming around you. What when you do these like book signings and meet and greet, I gotta imagine, is it affirming for you and the work you do? What's your experience meeting all these hundreds of people?
Oh yeah, it's extremely positive, and you get a sense of, the impact that Word on Fire has had, and that's nothing but a joy. That's why we do it, and that's why we, raise money, and why we have a office of people working, and all of our advertising and production. It all comes to that. I mean, these things are used by people to deepen their faith. So yeah, it's an extremely rewarding experience when hundreds of people basically tell you that your work has made a difference in their spiritual life. So absolutely. What you alluded to is also correct, that you do at the same time kind of long for the days of more anonymity. Because I would come and I would, usually you give 2 talks when they ask you to come. So I would do that and get a good crowd, because there's so many people that even the breakout sessions can get 800 or 1,000 people. But yeah, I wasn't, a well-known Catholic celebrity. So sure, I could walk around and in some ways there's something nice about that anonymity. You can get lost. Or I go to one of the restaurants and no one would care, but I can't really do that anymore. So that's true. That's the shadow side, but it's not a bad shadow to endure.
So you mentioned a couple years ago you gave the keynote talk, which was on the new evangelization. This year you gave a talk on 1st and 2nd Samuel. It was really well received. I think the ballroom they put you in held close to 1,000 or 1,500 people, and it was completely packed. So I want to devote a later episode fully to 2nd Samuel and your commentary book that you wrote on that. But give us a brief sketch of this talk on 1st and 2nd Samuel. What are some of the major themes you see in there?
Yeah, well, of course, it was based on the book, as you say, that I published, what was it, about a year ago, I guess? Mm-hmm. Part of that Brazos commentary series where they ask theologians to comment on the biblical books. And so I had done a lot of research into 2 Samuel, which is kind of taking it from the death of Saul and Jonathan forward, you know. And I just fell in love with those stories. I mean, I knew them. We read them in the office every year. They're in the liturgy, of course. But I had the chance really to get into that cycle of literature. And man, is it good, you know, just from a literary standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, and of course, a theological one. So anyway, I wrote the book, which is a little more on the academic side, and I wanted to bring that down to a more popular level. So I talked about, maybe 5 or 6 of the stories from 1 and 2 Samuel. The major theme is kingship. It's kingship. David, I argued, is a hinge figure, a pivotal figure, because he pivots backwards to Adam and then he pivots forward to Christ. He's a central figure in the biblical revelation because Adam was meant to be king. That's one way the rabbis and the Jewish commentators read him. He was king of Eden. And the idea was to defend it as a good king would do, but also to expand it. Now go on the march and make the whole world like Eden. Well, Adam failed in that. He was a bad king. So now look at the history of Israel as, in many ways, the search for the true king. Think of Tolkien now, the return of the king and the search, sometimes desperate to find the right ruler. Well, that's deeply biblical. And then David emerges as the greatest of Israel's kings. Now, mind you, he's also a fallen, compromised figure. He's the great king, yes, and he's a new Adam in the negative way because he falls as well. And therefore, Israel pivots forward from David to look for the absolutely true king. Now, read the New Testament with that in mind. And it jumps out at you from every page. David, David, David. The new David, the son of David, born in the city of David. The 3 sets of 14 generations in his genealogy, 14 being the number of Dawid, corresponding to those letters in Hebrew. So the point is obvious that they saw Jesus as the definitive king. And then, of course, Pilate putting on his cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Paul announcing him essentially as Christos, King, Lord, Kyrios. All of that is Davidic language. And so I try to bring that out. I try to bring forward the pivotal character of David.
In your talk, you recounted the history of Israel, and in particular this pattern of sin, chastisement, and redemption. And I think in one of the most unexpected and poignant moments, you tied it into the current sexual abuse crisis, or the one that hit its peak in the early 2000s. We're here just a few hours after the movie Spotlight won the Best Picture of the year, which was timely in a sense in relation to your talk. Tell us about this. How do you read the sexual abuse crisis through the lens of David and the biblical narrative?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Spotlight because I was thinking about it too. Being on the West Coast, one of the advantages is when you're watching the Oscars, well, the whole thing ends at 9 o'clock, local time. And I remember years ago back in Chicago, trying to watch till the end to see who wins Best Picture. And it's 11 o'clock. It's 11:30 p.m. I thought, it's actually over and it's before my bedtime, Anyway, I thought about the same thing, Brandon, that when I saw Spotlight, which is a movie I saw, and I did admire it. I had certain hesitations about it. But I thought of that too. Here's the connection. So go back to the beginning of 1 Samuel, and you hear about Eli, the high priest of Shiloh, who has 2 sons who are also priests, Hophni and Phinehas, and they're abusive to the people, including sexually abusive. So open up your Bibles and find those opening chapters of 1 Samuel. People complain. They bring complaints to Eli. Eli speaks to his two sons, but then doesn't really do anything, and they continue being abusive. And then God warns Eli, either do something or a disaster will befall Israel. He doesn't act. And a disaster does befall Israel. 30,000 Israelites are defeated by the Philistines, and the Ark of the Covenant is stolen. It was one of the worst disasters in the history of Israel. And I said to the people, does any of that story sound familiar to you? Where you've got abusive priests, you have people complaining to the high priest, their superior, who pays lip service, but then does nothing. And the result is a disaster for Israel. I said, that's the story of the last 25 years of the new Israel, of the church. Now, the reason Spotlight comes to mind, was the church to a degree now handed over to its enemies? Yeah, just as Israel was handed over to the Philistines, who worked God's chastisement. And so the Chicago Sun-Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, these various papers that were very critical of the church and caused a lot of anguish for the church as they went about the cleansing business. Yeah, that sounds like the Philistines to me. And I don't mean that. Please don't construe that as I'm being critical of those. They played a role, I would say, in God's providence. They played the role of cleansing and purifying the church. So I did think of that when Spotlight won. It wasn't really predicted to win the Best Picture. What's amazing is the Bible continues to shed light, doesn't it, on our own experience today.
One of the other big highlights of the LA Congress was you and I had the tremendous pleasure of having breakfast with Father Robert Spitzer. Tell us who Father Spitzer is and why you find his work so necessary and appealing.
Yeah, Robert Spitzer, maybe a lot of you know him from EWTN. He's had some popular programs over the years. He's a Jesuit priest. He was the president of Gonzaga University up in Washington State. And now he heads what's called the Majas Institute. Majas from the Jesuit, more, the greater glory of God. And Robert Spitzer is, first of all, he's a lovely human being. He's a great person, very generous, very kind. He's also intergalactically smart. You might get the impression watching his shows on EWTN that he's, a popularizer. And he is, I think, a good popular speaker. But man, is he a smart guy. And the books that he sent me a while ago, I've just read one of them. He's written actually a quartet of books, or is in the process of writing them. The one I read is called The Soul's Upward Yearning. And what I loved about it, I loved many things, but, Charles Taylor, the great philosopher, Catholic philosopher, talks about the buffered self. And it's a self that modernity created. And what he means by that is it's buffered, it's protected from any connection to the supernatural. What people before 1500 took for granted, that we were connected to the supernatural, that our lives found meaning in connection to that, began to fade away around 1500. And he said now it's largely the default position of most people in the West. That, it's this world and what the sciences know about it, what physiology and maybe psychology can tell us about ourselves. That's who we are, period. We're buffered from any connection to the higher world. Well, I think this book by Robert Spitzer is a beautiful debunking of that mythology, because he shows in a variety of ways how we are, in fact, connected to a world that goes beyond the physical, that the sciences can't possibly comment upon. And he does it in a very clever way, because he roams from Tolkien to Mircea Eliade to the epistemology of Bernard Lonergan to some of the highest musings of the astrophysicists. Now, I'll tell you, when Spitzer gets into the really high science language, he loses me. I'm not really trained in the sciences. And so some of the chapters, and the ones on epistemology, I'm sure those who don't have a philosophy background would find pretty hard to fathom. But I love the ranginess and kind of gymnastic flexibility of his mind as he goes all over the place. I especially loved the section on near-death experience, because Spitzer accesses and presents to us some of the latest research, which is fascinating. The number of people that have had these famous, most of us probably know about them, near-death experiences, but he's showing how the latest science can't explain these things through simply physiological appeals, like, lack of oxygen, or it's the hallucinations of a dying brain. There's so much evidence, the most compelling of which I thought was the visual experiences of people who are born blind. So people who have never seen, but yet when they have the near-death experience, they see very accurately what's going on. I think that's just really hard to explain on purely physiological brain chemistry grounds. But I love how he links it to, let's say, Lonergan's epistemology and his analysis of the various heuristic horizons of our knowing. Anyway, go get it. It's a great book. And I think, you can sort of read around in it if there's a chapter that you're finding confounding. I skipped parts of it that I didn't really understand, this high science stuff. But get it. I think it's a darn good rejoinder to the ideology of the buffered self.
You mentioned that Father Spitzer served as the president of Gonzaga University and that he has degrees in philosophy and physics. He's a poet. He's kind of a Renaissance man. To me, though, the most impressive thing is that he's done all that and he himself is legally blind. And he lost his sight late in life. When we were sitting there at breakfast, he was telling us about how he composes this work. You just described one of his books and how technically complex it is, philosophically and scientifically. To think that someone who can't read with his own eyes can somehow absorb all of this material and synthesize it. I asked him, how do you do that? And he explained that, well, for about 2 or 3 hours a day, he sits in a chair and his assistant just reads, and he just takes it all in. And I said, well, did you develop that capacity later in life, or did you have that before you lost your sight? And he said, well, I've always had sort of this photographic memory, and we kind of agreed that that was God providentially preparing him for losing his sight. He gave him this tremendous gift, this capacity to remember. I want to ask you the title of it's eventually going to be either a quartet or a quintet, but the first book in this series that Father Spitzer wrote is called Finding True Happiness, Satisfying Our Restless Hearts. That kind of speaks to the approach you've used a lot when evangelizing, which is the Augustinian approach to God. Tell us about that approach and how it maybe differs from, say, the rational approach of Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, and they're linked in their own way. But, Augustine, I've often argued, summarizes Christian anthropology on the first page of the Confessions with the line that Spitzer alludes to, Lord, you've made us for yourself, and therefore our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. That's the best statement. I think the rest of Christian anthropology is an amplification of that. Lord, you made us for yourself. See, that from the beginning we're linked to God. God is not some distant object that some of us maybe find. Rather, for Augustine, God is always already present to us because he made us, and so we're marked by him, and he made us for himself. See, so he's the efficient cause, to use that language, and he's the final cause. We came from him, we're destined to return to him. Thomas calls it the exitus raditus rhythm. We come forth from God, and then we raditus, we return to God. But see, that all feels like something. And Augustine, great intellect, of course, but he was also someone very in touch with his, call them spiritual emotions. That feels like something. What it feels like is a restlessness that I always want more. So I come to know something, and I get great joy from that. Anyone that likes to read, or any scientist or philosopher, knows what I'm talking about. The joy of discovery. But then the minute you make that discovery and you feel the joy, well, what do you want to do but make more discoveries? No one's ever satisfied with what they've discovered. I used that word earlier, it's kind of a technical term, heuristic. It's from a Greek word heurisko, which means I'm looking for. Isn't that lovely? That I get something, but then I keep looking for more. Show me more of that. Every question I answer opens up 10 more questions, doesn't it? Look at Aquinas in the Summa. It's full of what? Questions. Questiones. His other work is called the Questiones Disputate, right? Disputed questions. He's questing all the time. And he'll answer something, and you say, yeah, that's a good answer. But now what? Another question. And answer that one. But then there's another question, too. And isn't this fun? And we'll ask thousands of questions. Now I'll put it in Spitzer's language, borrowed from Lonergan. The restless mind and heart that keeps asking and searching, heurisco, I'm looking for, is ultimately looking for the universally intelligible. That means, as Lonergan put it, I want to know everything about everything. My mind isn't satisfied till it knows everything about everything. What is that? There's a term we have for it in theology. It's called the beatific vision, right? The vision of God's essence. Because God is the completely intelligible ground of intelligibility, if I can put it that way. So every scientist, every philosopher, every psychologist, every ordinary person who's seeking to understand the roads in his neighborhood, see, is implicitly searching for God, because their restless hearts will prompt them more, see. What will satisfy the heart? Well, what does the Bible say? Only in God will my soul be at rest. Everything short of God will leave me hungry. Good. See, and tap into that hunger. This is my approach, as you suggested. Tap into that hunger. It'll lead you to God. It'll lead you to a sense of the inadequacy of this world, even as we love it and savor it, but we know it's inadequate. Look, heurisco, I'm looking more. I got a restless heart. Religious people are resistant to an ideological secularism that will essentially tell you, no, stop looking. That's what bugs me when I deal with the atheists, is they all claim the mantle of rationalism. And I say, the trouble with you guys is you stop asking the questions when they get really interesting. So I'm looking for the unconditioned ground of this whole universe. Don't tell me it's energy or matter or something as boring as that. I mean, I got a million questions. Once you say energy is the ultimate reality, are you joking? I got a million questions. What kind of energy? Energy in what form? At what state? At what level? At what quantum? Now get Spitzer. He'll fill in all the blanks there, all the words. But you see, my point is, you tell me matter or dumb energy is the ultimate ground of reality. You haven't satisfied my hungry heart at all. You've awakened it to a million more questions. I'm ranting now. I'm sorry. But I think that's the importance of the Augustinian thing you talk about, and the use that someone like Robert Spitzer has made of it.
Do you find that when trying to reach and evangelize specifically secular people who are buffered, as you said earlier in the episode, that appealing to this restlessness is more effective than, say, abstract philosophical arguments? And if so, why?
They dovetail, I would say. It depends. See, I always say you got to be light on your feet when it comes to evangelization. You got to be able to move in whatever direction you think is useful. As I talk about leading with beauty and so on, but I don't want to be ideological about that. I mean, you got to be somewhat ad hoc. Like, who is this person? What's on his or her mind? What's bugging them? What will work with them? Because, some people might read Thomas Aquinas and they'll say, oh, God, I don't know. I heard him when I was 14 and it changed my whole life. Well, I got my own interests and background, and who knows why that happened to me. But I think the evangelist should have a lot of, tools in the kit, or a lot of medicines in the bag, because it depends on whom you're talking to and what their interests are. Look at a William Lane Craig, who uses very high philosophical argumentation, which I think is quite effective when he debates on college campuses, with kids who their minds are just kind of awakening to these deeper questions. And I think having a good, rigorous philosopher is good in those situations. Some people, that doesn't do much for them. So like Spitzer, Tolkien's a way in. Good, fine. If that works, use it. And then see what happens is, if you're really curious about these things, you see how they all begin to dovetail. As Newman said, there's the converging lines of argument that all come together around a single point. And then you say, that's it. They're all pointing to the same place, So that's what I would say in terms of strategy.
It's time now for our regular listener question. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, we'd love to hear it. Just go to askbishopbarron.com and you can record a question. Every single week we choose one question to ask here on the show. Today we got a great question from Dan. It's in reference to a previous episode, and he asks a theological question about what sin is. So here's Dan.
Hello, this is Dan from Chicago. On a previous episode, Bishop Barron mentioned that St. Augustine, as well as other church fathers, taught that sin is a privation or lack of grace. Does this differ from the teaching of von Balthasar when he says things such as, sin is a reality, it is not nothing? Thank you for taking my question, and God bless.
Yeah, good. It's a very searching question, a good one. It was a breakthrough for the young Augustine, who was, of course, a Manichae. Remember, as a young man, he accepted this very dualist philosophy, a bit like Star Wars, where you've got the light side of the Force, dark side of the Force. He saw evil very much as a substantive thing that was battling good. And he was a Manichae for 9 years, remember. This is not like a little fleeting thing. He was a very respected, up-and-coming expert in the Manichaean faith. The breakthrough was this idea that comes from Plato and Plotinus, that evil is not a being, but rather a privatio boni is the Latin. It's a privation of the good. It liberated Augustine. It liberated him from this dualistic view, whereby there was this endless struggle between good and evil. Evil was a sort of match for the good, and all we can do is, struggle and so on. It gave him a way forward, which was to say, no, there's one God. There's one God who's good. Now, God permits these privationes, these privations of the good. Now we can get into the problem of suffering. But what I would do, though, with your comment from Balthasar, and again, I have to look at the context for all that in Balthasar. See, what people react to, which I totally understand, is that when you say, oh, evil isn't real, it's a lack of being, what they'll say is, yeah, but it feels real to me. And what they mean is psychologically, it has an enormous impact, which is very real. You know what I'm saying? It's experienced as extremely real. So I'm not denying that for a minute. And I think that's what Balthasar is endeavoring not to deny, is how powerfully evil is felt. It can sound like we're being, dismissive toward the fact of suffering. Henri de Lubac stands in the Augustinian tradition when he referred to sin as cette claudication mystérieuse in his French, this mysterious limp. What I like about that is it's like a corruption of the leg. The leg is supposed to be, straight and strong and you can walk. But there's this mysterious limp that we all have, that we don't walk the way we're supposed to. But see, that limp, that claudication, is a privation. It's a lack of what ought to be there. And that's I still think the best way to think about evil and sin. Otherwise, we fall into a dualism whereby God is face down by a sort of co-equal opponent. And that can't be right.
Well, thanks again for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. A couple things. We have links to all of the books and resources we mentioned in this episode at wordonfireshow.com. That includes both of Father Robert Spitzer's new books that Bishop Barron highly recommends. We also have all of our old episodes from the past. I think we have close to a dozen episodes now, so if you haven't heard those, be sure to go back and listen to them as well. Finally, we're going to spend the next couple episodes here discussing Bishop Barron's book, The Priority of Christ. This was released several years back, and it was just recently re-released, this week in fact, as a beautiful hardcover book. I really think it's one of his most substantial, important books theologically. And so we're going to spend some time unpacking that and looking at some of its major themes. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Word on Fire show.